Hello, I'm Rob Palmatier. I'm one of the co-authors of the textbook Marketing Strategy based on First Principles in Data Analytics. In this session, we're going to go through Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is focused on Market Principle 3, which is the idea that all competitors react. And if all competitors react, you need to manage your sustainable competitive advantage to build a barrier around your business. The agenda for today's session, I'm going to go through a little bit of introduction and outline why we think this is one of the first principles. Then I'm going to go through the approaches and frameworks for managing sustainable competitive advantage. First is an evolution over time on what did firms use as the biggest barriers for protecting their business over the last 50, 100 years, if you will. Then we're going to go through a customer equity perspective. This is a customer-centric way to account for the value and how strong your barriers is in your business, your barriers are for your business. Financial accounting doesn't naturally capture it, so we're going to use another accounting system and as a customer equity perspective. Then I'm going to go through another analysis technique or another research approach called customer experiments. Experiments are very good for figuring out different aspects of your business, and we're going to give it a demonstration within the customer equity perspective. Finally, I'm going to go through the framework for managing competitive advantage. Okay, all competitors react. All firms are out there putting in effort, time, resources, money to copy and to innovate, to come out with a way to better service customers. Very often, those customers that go after will be the same customers you're trying to protect. This idea that they're all out there going after your customers, if you will, is this third principle. Especially if you do the first two principles right. Let's say you're very good at identifying your target segment. You know how your customers migrate in your portfolio. You're starting to make you know your CLVs. You're making lots of sales and profits. I guarantee you, the bigger the sales and profits, the more the competitors are going to come after your business. Why? Because they see it as a good opportunity. So as these competitors react, you need a way to protect your business. The way we're going to protect our business is by building sustainable competitive advantage. That's just the term we use. That's the term we use for the barriers or the moat around our business. And you're going to see in many cases, you want to do both. You want to build walls around your business, and you also want to build a moat around your business. And that's going to protect you from competitors. Because guaranteed, if you're doing successful, competitors are going to come after you. So what are the requirements for an SCA? We'll go through those. Of the four first principles, though, probably the most difficult of the four is building sustainable competitive advantage. The first two principles, all customers differ, so you have to manage heterogeneity. All customers change, so you have to manage customer dynamics. Those principles are pretty straightforward. You can go execute them. This one, though, is very tough because you have very smart people at your competitors trying to do the same thing you're doing, trying to innovate, trying to build relationships, trying to build brands, trying to come after your customers. So we're going to spend actually the next 3 sessions after this one on this first principle, on how to build a barrier around our business. I think this is building an SCA is key since all competitors react, but I think this Sun Tzu statement captures it. Let's look at this. The art of war teaches, and so they wrote this is before Christ, Sun Tzu, ancient China. The art of war teaches us to rely not on the likelihood of the enemy's not coming, but our own readiness to receive him. Not on the chance of his not attacking, but rather on the fact that we have made our position unassailable. So the idea here is we know competitors are going to attack. We can't just guess that they're not going to come. We know they're going to attack. Because we know they're going to attack, we have to make our position unassailable. And that's what we're trying to do with SCAs. Okay, a firm has an SCA when it's able to generate more customer value than competitor firms in an industry with the same set of products. A good SCA must meet 3 criteria. Customers must care about it. The firm has to do it better than competitors, which generates a relative advantage. And third, it must be hard to duplicate or substitute. If you don't, let's say you do the first two, the customers care, you build a relative advantage, but if customers can copy you, if your competitors can copy you, they'll just do the exact same thing you're doing it, maybe at a little lower price. Maybe they have a lower labor rate. They're doing a me-proof product and they manufacture offshore. So it has to be hard to duplicate. Very often, this hard to duplicate is the most difficult part of an SCA. So what we're learning is thus being first with a new idea is not sufficient to create a barrier. There was one study that showed out of all the new innovations, 10 years later, only 11% of those new markets were being led. The market share leader was by the person who invented the new technology. Very often, being first is not enough because people can just copy you. So often, to make an SCA hard to copy, firms turn to market-based sources of SCA. There are other sources. We're going to focus, being in a market strategy, we're going to focus on market-based sources. And there's really three major market-based sources of SCA. The first is brands. You build really strong brands. If you think of a company like Coca-Cola, they have a very strong brand. It's not hard to knock off Coca-Cola because of the recipe. It's hard to knock off Coca-Cola because of their brand. The second way is offerings. You can just have better products. For a long time, Intel microprocessors were the best product in the market. And they were competing just on offering. But after a while, they came to understand that offering wasn't enough. So they did the Intel Inside campaign to build a brand around their microprocessor. So then they had offering, plus they had brand as a sustainable competitive advantage. Third is relationships. Relationships are typically better in services, like with your hairdresser, your doctor, or in large B2B firms where it's very cost-effective to develop a relationship. You don't use it in consumer goods. In consumer goods, you often use brands. Why? Because there's so many consumers out there, it's too hard to develop an individual relationship with each one of them. So overall, the three sources of sustainable competitive advantage, brands, offering, relationship, we give it an acronym we call BORE. Brand, offering, relationship. This is where we spend most of our money in marketing, building brands, offering, and relationship. But recognize, good firms don't just use one of these as a sustainable competitive advantage. They bundle multiple components. Let's look at the example of Starbucks. What do you think Starbucks' sustainable competitive advantage is? It has a high-quality brand valued at over $5 billion. Some people are very emotionally attached to that Starbucks cup in their hand. They do it every morning. They have a distinct offering of coffee drinks and store environments. They spend a lot of effort to make that store environment friendly. They hire good employees and pay them decent with medical and dental and retirement plans. Why? Because they want those customers, those employees to be loyal, good at customer service, and build relationships with their customers. So they use brands and relationship and offerings. These three sources go together and make it very hard for somebody to knock off Starbucks. They're continuing to innovate. Tavana Tea Products is a brand new product they're doing. So they're going to have another new product coming out. And they're adding technology-based services like mobile phone payment. All of these together makes brand, offering, relationship. That's the barrier for some other company to come out and start competing with Starbucks. This is an overall grid that goes through each of the three market-based assets as a source of competitive advantage. It talks the barriers to duplication. Brand image resides in the consumer's mind, hard to copy. Sometimes products have performance benefits or patents. Relationships lead to trust and commitment. We look at where it's most effective. Consumer, business, relationships or business to business. These are both. And then we give a few examples of firms that do this. Okay, so overall, our premise is competitive reaction, that competitors react is a fundamental assumption of marketing strategy. Competitors can displace firms in many different ways. Let's think of some of the ways. They can come out with a new technical innovation. They can exploit changes in customers' desire due to culture environment. Maybe all of a sudden people are getting more sensitive to diamonds, blood diamonds, and so diamonds that aren't from certain parts of the world would maybe be seen as more positive. Individual entrepreneurship. How many new tech businesses have been started in garages and expand to become multi-billion-dollar businesses? Me do copycat, somebody that just takes your idea and manufactures it in a cheaper location. Thus, managers need to anticipate these actions and build competitive advantage, sustainable competitive advantage. So market principle 3 is that all competitors react, and effective marketing strategy must manage sustainable competitive advantage. So in essence, we know competitors are coming after us. We need to understand how to build it. So what we're going to turn to next are the approaches for managing sustainable competitive advantage. Let's look at the evolution over time. If we go to the pre-industrial age, let's look at, we're in England thousands of years ago. How was things working? How was exchange working? Marketing, if you will. What was happening was this. A farmer would grow the produce. They would bring it into the town and maybe sell it to the local little shopkeeper. They had a personal relationship. The shopkeeper would sell it to other people in the town. There might be a blacksmith, manufacturing. Probably 80 or 90% of what was being done was being manufactured in that own little village. If somebody had bad product, if one of the farmers had rotten vegetables, how quick would everybody know about that? They did not give out bad product because they had to maintain their trusting relationship with the shopkeeper and everyone involved. So interpersonal relationships was really the whole SCA when firms first started in the pre-industrial age, these little small businesses. But then we went into the industrial revolution. Mass production started. What did this cause? Factories were producing large amount of goods and they had to distribute them over a large area. So because they were distributing, no longer did they know the person they were selling to or buying from. So relationship had to be, maybe it became lesser important. Brands became important. All the original brands were just people's name. They were just extending their relationship. If you look at Ferrari, JCPenney, Gillette, these were companies that originally had relationships with their customers, but then they grew so big, they turned their name into a brand of their business and say, hey, we'll stand behind our brand. So brands became really important in the Industrial Revolution. Third, in the technology revolution, there was all sorts of new digital and knowledge economy. A lot of that came from digital electronics and such. And when that happened, offerings became big. You look at phones and computers and all sorts of electronics goods. In this case, very often innovation is generated. If you look at the two companies with some of the highest valuations in the world, Apple and Google, they weren't even in existence. They expanded with the new technology and grew very, very quick. So product technology. Interesting, Apple and Coke exceeded Coke. Coke's value came from the brand, but Google and Apple came from their offering. Now people are arguing, so we have brand offering relationships. Some people are arguing that relationship is coming back to be important. Why is relationships coming more important? Let me give you an example of a firm as they shift to services. Right now, 85% of the U.S. economy is services, as judged by the U.S. government. They rate every firm as a product or service firm. That number has increased by 30 or 40% over the last couple decades. Why has that happened? Prices of services are going up, prices of products are going down. People are buying more services and selling more services. Services require more of a relationship to deliver because they're intangible and they're hard to evaluate. And you want to have a relationship with your service provider to manage that risk. But this is even becoming as part of a strategy. GE did it, Emerson Electric did it. Let me give you an example of how it worked with Emerson Electric. Emerson Electric, a Fortune 100 firm with 61 business units, one of their business units made refrigeration equipment. This would be the kind of equipment you would find in a grocery store with the lettuce, maybe another one with meat and produce in it and dairy products. They used to sell those, and what happened is an international firm from China actually made this product, metal, plastic, a few moving parts. They were able to manufacture high quality refrigeration equipment at about and sell it 30 or 40% less than Emerson. So Emerson, obviously that damaged their business a lot because competitors reacted. So then Emerson had to react. What they came to realize is that grocery stores didn't really care about refrigeration equipment. They're into the business of selling groceries. So they went to them and said, this is what we'll do. They said, we'll come and buy all your refrigeration equipment from you. We'll lease it to you, and there's actually some financial advantages for the grocery store to do that. And we'll also do this. We will maintain it. If it ever fails, we will warranty any spoilage you have because our equipment fails. We'll maintain it so the temperature is at the right bands, and if there's water spraying on the vegetables, we'll maintain that. And then we'll upkeep it. We'll remove them and put new ones in at some frequency of 3 to 4 years that we think is appropriate. Would you like this service contract? The same way Otis Elevator. They barely make money on the elevator. In some cases, they lose it, and they make money on the maintenance agreement. So Emerson Electric ended up shifting from being into the business of selling refrigeration equipment to providing the whole service of refrigeration. They were successful in doing that. Now, can this firm that came in, this Me Too copycat selling refrigeration equipment, can they come from, let's say, China to sell into this market? No, they can't. Why? Because they don't have the relationships with all these people. People aren't willing to buy the service agreement from somebody in another continent. So in this case, they rebundled what they're selling, and their SCA is becoming more of the relationships and the trust with the firm rather than just the product. And that's the reason why relationships are coming back in, is because the economy in the US is becoming so large of a service economy today. And relationships are more important than services. But you can see overall, we're arguing today all 3 sources of sustainable competitive advantage are important. Okay, so if I said there's 3 ways we can build SCA, but one problem we have is accounting metrics. If you look at the balance sheet of a firm, let me give an example. Intel. When Intel wants to build a new fab, that's what they call a manufacturing plant for microprocessors. When they want to build a new fab, it might cost $1 billion. When they spend that $1 billion to build this asset, it goes onto the balance sheet. And then every year it might depreciate a little bit. But that $1 million is not considered expense in that year's profit and loss. It's an asset. They bought an asset, so the money, that cash goes to an asset. However, when Intel spent nearly $1 billion on the marketing campaign of Intel Inside, how did the accountants treat that $1 billion? They don't treat that as an asset. What they treat it as is this. Every year when you spend $1 on marketing, it has to be expensed in that year. So even after you spend $1 billion on the manufacturing plant, they get to show that money as an asset being depreciated. They spend $1 billion on marketing, it's treated as a complete expense as if at the end of the year it's gone. But guess what? Intel Inside was one of the most successful campaigns in the B2B world ever. What they did is Intel was finding out that there was only 4 or 5 large manufacturers in the world that were buying their microprocessors. Companies like Dell, HP, maybe IBM, Lenovo in the past. And when there's only 5 buyers, they were beating them up on price, and AMD was a competitor, and sometimes AMD's product was good enough. So Dell Computer, for instance, would say, hey, if you charge me this high price, I'm going to buy them from AMD and put them in my computers I sell. Intel didn't want that to happen, so they wanted to stop just competing on the offering, and they wanted to add another source of sustainable competitive advantage. By putting the sticker on the computer, so what they did is they paid a co-op marketing budget to put a sticker on every computer called Intel Inside. And they did some advertising campaigns and such. By doing that, they made consumers aware of what kind of microprocessors is in the computer. And they added some prestige and status. So now people would say, geez, I don't really know what a microprocessor does, but I know I want the Intel Inside because I perceive that as being better. Once they were able to do that, they were able to reduce the pressure from Dell saying, hey, I'm going to switch to AMD. AMD couldn't switch to, or Dell couldn't switch to AMD because consumers were wanting to have Intel Inside. So that was a very good way to build sustainable competitive advantage. But the thing I want to bring up is that the money being spent is considered an expense, and the asset you're building, that awareness, that brand image, is not tracked anywhere in the accounting reports. So the accountants, you could have two firms here, one with a strong brand, one without a strong brand, and there's no way on the balance sheet of an accounting firm, of an accounting statement, can you see that. So marketers have come up with a way to track that. We call it customer equity. Customer equity is how we track the assets associated with these SCAs. The premise is customers are considered a financial asset which should be measured, managed, and maximized. Treat customer just like any other asset, even though the accounting don't treat customers or customers' brands or such as an asset. Customer equity is not captured on a balance sheet. Spending on building equity, brands, relationship is treated as an expense. So why do we want to bother with customer-centric accounting, this customer equity measure? Because in many cases, Coca-Cola, for example, the brand is the number one driver, is their number one SCA, and is their number one driver of sales and profit. Oh, I'll have a Coke. However, the firm is not capturing that in their balance sheet. That brand value doesn't show up, so we need to capture it. Also, these equities are the primary sources of SCA, so we should be able to see it. And it also captures the long-term impact of marketing action. When you spend, like the Intel Inside example shows, when they build a marketing campaign like that, it doesn't end at the end of the year. Those brands are good for multiple years. So we want it to be able to last past a year. So we come up with this technique, and I'm going to give it with an example. We call it the customer equity perspective or the equity stack. So let's go build it. This is the total value to the customer is captured in this stack. And I'm going to do it in an example of a beer. First, I'm going to start with an offering. Offering equity is defined as the core benefits relative to the cost of an offering. Offering equity, let's think of it in a beer example. If I took a bottle of beer and I put it in a paper sack and I asked you to taste it. You tasted it, and then I said, how much would you pay for that? You don't know the brand. You'd say, I'd pay $5 for that beer. It tastes pretty good. So the offering equity with price, performance, that's it, $5. But let's say now I want to add to that offering equity, brand equity. Brand equity is the set of brand assets and liabilities linked to the brand name, assets, symbols, or subtract from the value. Brand equity, in the beer example, would be if I took the bag off the beer and say, oh, that's my favorite brand. Let's say it's a Heineken. You say, geez, I really like Heineken. I say, how much will you pay for it? You say, well, I typically pay $8 for a Heineken. The extra $3 on top of the $5 is the brand equity. That's how much extra you'll pay besides just the product. And you say, well, do people really pay for that? Yes. Look at Tiffany jewelry. You can buy the same diamond at a store down the street for half the price. That extra price is to get it in the turquoise bag because we know brand is worth something. Why is it worth something? If you bring home a jewelry and it's in that turquoise bag and people say, wow, that's a Tiffany, that means something to the person receiving it. Now the last one we're going to do is relational equity. In our beer example, how much would you pay for that beer if it was delivered by your favorite bartender? So $5 was just what the beer was worth. $8, the extra $3 was the brand equity. The extra on top of that, maybe you'll spend $12 for the beer if it's served by your favorite bartender. Why? Because you have a relationship with that bartender. You could buy the beer at a bar down the street for cheaper, but then you don't get to talk to your bartender. So you're willing to pay $12. The 8 to 12, that extra $4, that's the relational equity. We stack those three together. All together, the beer gives you $12. There might be another example of a beer over here that will only give you, it only costs $4 for the beer. Maybe the offering isn't as good. There's a bad brand and bad relationship or no relationship. All those stacked together is kind of how we measure the value of your SCA. Just like you'd measure the value of a factory on the accounting statement on the balance sheet, we look at customer equity as a way to capture. Realize brand equity isn't always positive. There's a good example with Hyundai automobiles. Hyundai's been working a lot of times to improve their product of their offering, to make the cars more look better, to make them last longer, give a good warranty. But they have a problem when they compete against Toyota. And here's kind of a famous study. They take a car, they strip all the symbols off so you can't tell if it's a Toyota or a Hyundai. And they go to consumers and they say, how much will you pay for this car? It gives the gas mileage, they let them look at it, blah, blah, blah. And people say, I'll pay you $20,000 for that car. You say, oh, okay, so that's the offering. They say, well, what if I make it, oh, guess what, this is a Toyota, how much will you pay? You say, I'll pay you $25,000 for that car if it's Toyota. Same exact attributes, but the brand equity, because they think they make reliable cars, etc., they get $25,000, that would be the brand equity. They say, what if it's a Hyundai? They say, I'll pay you $18,000. You'll pay less than not knowing the brand. It has a negative brand equity. Why is that? Because Hyundai's got associated for cars being cheaper. Walmart is another company that has fairly low brand equity. So brand doesn't have to be always positive. It typically is because you spend a lot of money to make it positive, but in some cases it can be negative. These three stacked together, we call the equity stack. There's multiple arguments for why you want to use an equity stack in order to understand your sustainable competitive advantage. One, Bohr equities are often the primary source of your SCA. It allows firm to make better decisions. If I'm spending money building a brand, I need to know how much value I'm generating. Think of an example. Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble have brand managers of like Tide soap. Let's say you're a brand manager of Tide soap and you're paid a bonus at the end of each year on how much money you make. Seems reasonable. But if you know you're going to leave the job next year, you might slow down advertising this year because you know if you don't spend money on advertising, it'll show having higher profits in this year. Because if you're going to spend $1 million in advertising, you don't spend it, that shows right down in the bottom line a profit. So then you're going to get a bigger bonus. But the brand drop, it probably will cause your brand equity to go down. But that's not going to affect things till next year or the year after. So if you don't measure it, people might make suboptimal decisions. So typically firms like Procter & Gamble, they measure the brand equity. There's firms out there, BAV for example, Interbrand, they're out there measuring brand equity of different firms. It allows you to make optimal decisions. Effective customer equity systems represent actually an SCA in their own right. Procter & Gamble got good at understanding what their brand equity is, so they're better able to spend advertising dollars. Many firms' SCA results from Bohr investments, but there are other sources. In marketing, this is marketing strategy, so we're going to focus on brands, offering, relationship, but there is other things that firms do. That's just not the focus of ours. I wanted to bring that up to say this isn't the only way, even though in many cases they're finding them the hardest to duplicate. So very often we use experiments. We use experiments as a method, and it can help us determine equity and how much equity we're building. For example, we might want to do an advertisement and we want to know how much, let's say we're going to launch a new product. Maybe Procter & Gamble is offering a new product called the Swiffer. If we want to know how much brand equity we want to build, we could go and how much advertising to spend. We could do a study in 2 cities that are very similar to each other. In one, we launched a product and we put $5 million of advertising. The other city, we launch a product, we do $1 million of advertising. We compare the difference over time. It gives us insight into how much brand equity we want to build. I'm going to give you an example using an experiment and what are some of the benefits of it. The good things about experiments is they test causality. In other words, if I randomly put things in 2 groups and one of them I do something and the other I don't, and then I look at the different outcome, I can attribute the outcome to the treatment or the experiment. We often use it after we find something, we have an idea and we want to confirm it's going to work. So it's often our way to test things. The process is you randomly divide customers into 2 groups. You do nothing to one group, it's a control group. You do your treatment or your condition to other groups, and it can be more than one. But you don't even often you don't even want the employees to know. Just like when you do medical research called double blind. Not only do you give the patient a placebo, you also don't tell the doctor which one's getting the placebo and the real pill, so that there's nothing else that could confound the experiment. After a period of time, you test the difference in the outcomes and see what happened. And we go through this in more detail in 4.1. But here's just a really simple example. You want to get people to buy supplementing items when they're buying an airline ticket. Let's say you're selling airline tickets online. And so when you're selling the airline tickets, you can sell some hotels, rental cars, and other stuff on the site. You have an existing ad, but your boss wants you to use a new swimsuit ad. You take some time, you design a new experiment. We want to have a random assignment to customers, and we're going to compare these. We want to make sure there's nothing else different. We don't want to run one experiment on one time a day, another in a different time of day. Typically what we do, we might even alternate. We run one, the next customer gets the other ad, and we compare these two ads. Let's see how they work. Here's the results. This is how many, the ad we're using now, this is how many extra dollars they spent on average. Here it is with a new swimsuit ad. And this is all done in Excel. We compare the average or the mean. So, wow, we made $231 more on the swimsuit ad. We also may look at the median and the standard deviation. But is this 231 statistically significant? You can do a simple t-test using Excel, and you find the probability this was random was only 4%. Typically we use 5% as a cutoff, so we say this is a meaningful difference, this $231. So typically when we run an experiment, we always want to see, is the difference random, or what's the probability the difference was random? If you just toss a coin twice and you get a heads and tails, or let's say you get two tails in a row, you want to check if that's significant. You have to run a larger number of samples. If you run it 100 times, you'll see that it'll balance out at about 50-50, 50 heads, 50 tails. If you only do it twice or 3 times, you could get heads, heads, heads. And you say, wow, this coin must always give heads. No, you got to go long enough so it balances out. This statistical test allows you to understand if you've gone long enough based on that big a sample, that amount of change is at random. Typically, we use experiments very often to test how our marketing treatments are work, our BOR strategies. And all this can come from Excel, very simple way. But sometimes you can't randomly assign things. For example, let's say you wanted to understand CEO. How important was a CEO to a company? You can't randomly assign CEOs to companies and do an experiment. So in these, you often do natural experiments. They're not as strong a test of causality, but here would be an example of one. Let's say a competitor entered your market and started coming directly against your product with a head-to-head competition. And you had 3 sales regions, and each sales region did something different. One matched price of the new competitor, another held price constant, the third just gave free shipping. If you had that happen, let's say for a year after this competitor entered with a cheaper price, you could go back and test and say what strategy worked the best. You didn't randomly assign these 3 conditions. That's what people actually did in the market. You're just going to see the results. Very often, though, you have to control for other things that might cause a difference. Brand strength in those different territories, the type of product sold, the size of customers. And what we do on these is we control for these other variables, these other covariates. And then we can look at what strategy worked better. So this is how we would do a natural experiment. So experiments are a very powerful tool we want to use to test which of our BOR strategies work the best for building sustainable competitive advantage. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the framework for managing SCA's competitive advantage. What are the inputs? Well, you notice the inputs are just the outputs of the previous 2 market principles. You have to do the first steps right. You have to segment your customers, figure out which target you're going after, and how you're going to position. You also then, after you do that, you manage customer dynamics by segmenting your own customer portfolio into acquisition, expansion, and retention groups and finding the personas. And then you come up with the positioning strategies for those personas. So the overall positioning is for the whole market, and then you have air positioning statements for each persona. Then you look at air strategies. What strategies work the best for acquisition, expansion, retention across the different personas? If you remember that air strategy grid. You also have to look at future trends because these things might impact your SCA. If you see there's a trend for environmental sustainability, you better start making your cars more energy efficient. And some of these take a long time to do, so you want to look at these trends. What are the approaches and processes? One is the BOR, or the Brand Offering Relationship Equity Stack. We have the air strategy and the BOR equity grid that I'm going to go through here just in a minute. And then what we're going to spend the next 3 sessions on is really brand and relationship and innovation processes. How do you really do brand management, relationship management, R&D management? Here's some of the analysis: field experiment, conjoints, multivariate, and choice models. And some of these we'll talk in later sessions. So what is the output of this? You get what your existing SCA is and what your future SCA. How are you going to compete in the future? You're also going to come out with your strategy for brand. So if you're Starbucks, what is your branding strategy? What is your offering strategy? What is your relationship strategy? How are these going to work together to build your SCA? And this is where we're going to spend the next 3 sessions. Okay, I want to go through on how these 2 grids fit together. The air strategy grid we talked about earlier in Market Principle 2. We have each of these personas across the 3 stages. The personas capture different customer heterogeneity. We know that in our own customer portfolio, customers can be different, so we give them a different persona name. We treat customers differently across acquisition, expansion, and retention, and that captures customer dynamics, which is Market Principle 2. This feeds into the BOR equity grid. The BOR equity grid talks about what is our marketing objective for brands, offering, and relationship. How does it offer a relative advantage? These relative advantages are going to come, how are we competing up here? And how are we going to have sustainability? We also feed in these environmental trends. If we have this completed, that tells us how to go spend our money in brands, offering, and relationships. That's our roadmap for spending money. It comes out of the air strategy grid and environmental trends. Okay, so the process for managing SCA. The first step is to complete your air strategy grid, and you'll do that really in Market Principle 2. What are your personas? What is your strategy in each of the 3 stages of acquisition, expansion, and retention? Then you look at what are the key trends. You pull that information in. Those 2 feed into the BOR equity grid. You complete it to describe your marketing objective, your relative advantage, your source of sustainability, what you want to achieve from brand, offering, and relationships. There's actually a natural sequence across these. Typically, a firm comes up with their brand strategy first. Why? Brand comes right out of the overall firm's positioning strategy. And brands are very hard to change. We'll talk about this more next time, but very hard to change. So if you're going to be a Tiffany with a high-end brand, or you're going to be a BMW with a high-end brand, you can't all of a sudden change that and say, next week I'm going to be a low-end supplier. That brand takes many years, if not decades, to build, and it has to be consistent. So first thing, you come out with your brand decisions. Then you develop offerings to support your brand. If your brand is BMW and you want to have the ultimate driving machine, you need to come up with offerings that fit that market position, that branding argument. After you do offering, then relationships are typically last. Why are they last? Relationships come into play typically when you're delivering your product. That kind of happens last. It's tied into your overall strategy, but it's usually done last. So like now, when you go buy a BMW, they want you to understand all their new technology like the iDrive. So they force the salespeople, they're required to sit in the car with you and program your phone, show you how it works, put your home number, your work number, get it all working because there's so much technology they've embedded in it. They're worried that people won't understand it. They really work to build that relationship with the salesperson and the dealership and the customer. They give you a lot of free maintenance because they want you to bring it back so they maintain that relationship. Because they understood in the past, sometimes those relationships would undermine future purchases. So this really ends this session. which is on market principle 3. All competitors react, so I have to manage SCA. A couple things we took out of it. One that's important is that these are important assets that you spend years to build, and the way we track them is through the Bohr equity grid, or stacked, the equity perspective, where we stack the three together in the beer example, where we have value equity, brand equity, and relationship equity. Those together is a way we measure how strong our sustainable competitive advantage is. And then we see, coming out of this, we're going to have a Bohr grid, Bohr strategy grid, and that's going to tell us what we want to achieve with brand, offering, relationships. The next 3 sessions, one on brands, one on offering, and one on relationship, is going to tell us now how to execute it, how to implement these strategies once we know what we want to achieve. Well, thank you. Until next time.